flow that she's going to take us through really quick because there's the two types of flows, your screen flows and your auto launch flows. And so, yeah, she's created one. And then I'm going to run through our use case example.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just share my screen so that you guys can see at least visually what's been built and what I'm talking about. So flows, yeah. So what is flows and what can we do about it? Just to start with it, it is just a very powerful automation tool, just like process builders, but not exactly up to that mark with process builders, because again, we don't need to know coding to have flows defined. And all we need is need to know basic variables and how the logic works in order to build a flow. So there are certain limits.
Quick questions. I just have a quick question. What's, like, from your guys' experience in terms of when you're listening to a use case, what are like the definitions of why you should do a flow over a process builder or any other process?
Go ahead. I'll let you. It's your turn.
So flows provide a lot more flexibility than the process builders. For example, if you see there's a delete record here, so you don't have the power to delete any records through a process builder. Flow allows you to do that. Then there is a decision-making parameter, which is again more powerful, which allows you to spread its branches and just put conditions, and then they don't even have to be related to the original records. Like, you know how process builders work, you have to define a record, like you say an attendee over here, and then everything flows through this attendee record, and they all flow in almost the same manner, and everything needs to be updated in a similar way. But with flows, like we saw the demo that Andrea provided with session attendees, you can't do that with process builders, because you can't have in terms of parent child. From the parent you can't create the child objects, right? If you have to term it in that way.
So just to kind of clarify, what you're saying is that even if the attendee record is what initiated the start on a process builder, you can only do criteria off the attendee or anything that's a higher relation to the attendee, not a smaller relation, right? Like a session attendee record. So then, or even separate, right? Like attendee is related to event, but not directly related to a session at that point in time. So with a flow, you can essentially say what my decision point isn't off of the record that started, but maybe it's off of a session related to the event or related to the attendee. Is that how I'm understanding it?
That's right. So process builder is limited to only being able to see the child records of the one that started the process, and all needs updated in a similar way. But with flows, it is possible to only update the child records that match a condition, and they don't even have to be related to the original records. Yep. So that's basically
well, and then like the looping thing was the biggest part too, right?
Yeah, with process builder, you can update multiple child records, but you have to update all of them in the exact same way. So with flow, like what we're doing with the use case is we're looping through the child records that we pulled based on certain criteria. We didn't pull all of them, just the ones that were based on the criteria we set. And then we can work with them that way. So we can kind of isolate the records we want to work with. That's part of the looping logic that you get with flow that you can't really do with process builder.
So you just open the flow builder, and then you see a toolbox over there on the left. You see different elements that comes into picture you can use with screen, action, subflow. I've not worked with subflow, but I guess it's basically using a flow inside a flow, and just correct me if you're wrong. And then the logic, decision, assignment, and loop variables you can use according to the process requirement. And then we have data models like create records, update records. Get records is basically querying the records, or you can say searching for the records, and then putting conditions and then performing further actions from it. And then delete records using a flow. So what I've created here is like a simple flow for any user. So basically there are two types of flows. One is auto launch flow, which Andrea will show in some time. And what I've done is user based flow, or It's also called a screen flow, where you essentially require a user input, and then that flow just works behind the scenes to have get records, update records, whatever function that you want to perform in the background. So I'll just show how it works first, and then I can get back in how I created different elements inside it. So there is this nice feature Flow has, the debug button. So while I run this flow, I can actually see the details in here, which shows where the flow is at, or at what process. If it fails, it just shows you the runtime processing of the flow. So basically, I have also put this here on. So basically, view page or record
Wait,
page or any other.
Ashwarya, hey, Ashwarya, you just cut out. Can you start from the top again? Maybe it
What
was
did you
just
hear
for me.
last? Did you hear the debug?
I had you had that Visual Force page open before you went to the contact screen. It had cut out for me.
Okay, so this is, so basically what I'm doing over here, I'm allowing the user to enter in the first name and the last name for the contact, and then I'm allowing him to define the account on it. And then I have put in a toggle over here which says that if this contact already exists, you just update the existing record with the account. So, and then if they set it to true, every time I click next, it would just run according to the process. So let me just enter your quickly a name.
Did you create this?
Uh-huh.
Like this Visual Force page?
Yeah, so it's a screen flow. It will show up a nice visual force page. So this is a screen which I have built inside a flow. There is an element which is called as screen. So inside the screen, I have defined the name,
Okay, yeah.
first name, last name, and whatever I have to define over here. And then there is a record choice element which I've included to search for the accounts, and a toggle which I can label as I want and then work with it accordingly. So what I'm doing here, I have Ashley Wagner associated with United Oil and Gas Singapore. And now it's gonna search the database. If it has an existing contact, it would just update the existing contact with this account. If not, it would just create a new contact. So I will just say next.
Yeah, so the purpose of this window, so why she's in this debug mode, is you can actually test your flow before saving it and activating it, so you have fewer versions of a process. So you're not saving, activating, testing, going back and tweaking.
Oh, sure.
Like
Which you do have to do with Process Builder.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So now I have a contact created with this, and now just to see again with a different output, we'll again have the same input given to this flow just to see if it creates a different contact or updates the original one with a different account. So I'll select this toggle, I'll hit next, and it's done. So I'll just update the contact once again, and I should just see the account updated to Gene Point, because that's the input that I have provided. There it is.
Okay.
So on the screen, all I'm showing is just the user input, and then in the backend, what I'm processing is, I'll just show you all the screens. So basically it starts with a screen element, right? So here I've provided the name where.
And quick question here too. Did you fill like everything in on this right-hand side, or like how did you know what to enter?
So I just entered the API name, right? It's a compulsory field. These things were auto-populated, and then all the things that I needed, like the first name and the last name. So I populated contact first name, right? And then, sorry, contact first name. So if I just do like contact, I would get so this is a variable that I have created and that I'm referencing. So everything I'm doing over here on the input screen, I'm storing it inside a variable, which I'm going to use later on, right? Because I'm getting the input from the user, I'm storing it in a variable, and later I'm using that variable to process it further. So I am just having contact first name from here. It's a lot of.
There's two types of variables. You have your record variables and record collection variables. You can just think of variables as containers where you can store data that you can use at any point in your flow.
Yeah, so that's how I got the first name. So all I filled out was first name, last name, and then store output values, which again, I defined the contact first name and last name, right? And then on the account, I had this as record choice set kind of a variable. So this is my manager tab, where I get to define all the variables. So the variable I defined for inputting the account. So basically what this part where I, search for all the accounts. So it is a record choice set where I select which record I need, that I define in the, so I choose the object, right? And then I select the name, that I want to see the name of the records under that object. And then I only store the ID of that, because I don't really need a name to process, because there could be multiple account having the same names. I initially need the IDs to be specific for processing it further. So I just store the ID of that record, right? And then
And
yeah,
quick question too. So are you filtering, or are those just all the accounts that are just in this org?
all the accounts. I'm not. If you want, you
Oh,
can
sure.
just filter it out based on the
Oh, I
conditions.
see
So we
right there. Okay.
condition criteria. If you want, you can filter it out based on conditions. Then
Okay.
once I get all those things, I am searching to find a match for the contact with the first name and last name. So I simply put a condition first name equals to the contact first name. This is the variable that we have stored the user input, and again the last name. So this will basically search all of the contact records having those first name and last names, and then it would pick up the first
So is
record.
this it? So in this, is this like the duplicate rule, or like essentially duplicate rules are excluded if you have them enabled in your org, since you're doing it this way, or?
So I have not in this considered the duplicate rule criteria. If you want, we can of course make it more unique to have, because
Like,
all I don't get your question. Can you
This
repeat
is,
that?
yeah, this is essentially replicating a duplicate rule. So I guess this would be assuming that there are no duplicate rules existing with these criteria. If you did have duplicate rules, you could bypass the decision altogether.
and it would just obviously use that and match. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it.
So then after getting the records, I'm just making a decision whether I want to create a new contact or I just want to update an existing one. So I just label the outcomes in such an order. And if I'm updating the existing one, I am making sure that the toggle bar is true, because that's what I've requested, the user is requesting. And then I've created a variable find a match, which will just, that should be false essentially for it to
Wait, wait,
update the.
wait. I feel like you're just talking a little too fast, because just remember, no, I there's a lot of stuff that I'm seeing that's new. So if you can hit cancel. So you're adding this update or create decision because you've essentially said, all right, so I've collected information. You've now defined an account. You're gonna take the information that you have now from that variable to this find a match potentially. If it finds a match on first name, last name, you're gonna update the account related to that existing contact, right? Or you're gonna replace the existing contact with the account defined on the screen.
Yep.
It's the latter, right?
So basically everything I'm storing in a variable, record set variable, and that
Yeah.
variable be updating the existing records if there's a match found.
But you're not like, yeah, so if a match is found and the match is only on the first name and last name, so the only like exclusion or like additional piece that maybe that existing contact didn't match on is the account name. And so you're just going to say, okay, we found it, it's related to a different account, now I'm just going to replace the account with what was defined on the form.
Correct. Yes.
Correct. Okay. And then in the decision, are you essentially just before so update or create, it's essentially saying, did we find a match?
Correct.
Mhm.
Right. Okay.
Find
All right. Sorry. All right. Now, if you go back into decision, I think I'm with you now for at least the context.
Okay, so in the outcome, I have just said update. So there are two outcomes. One is create new, which is the default one, and
Okay.
update. For updating the existing ones, so the toggle value that I've provided over here, this thing, it should be true, because that's how we are checking.
Oh, you're saying if this contact already exists, update the existing record with the new account.
If they want to, yeah.
You got it. Okay.
Yep. So that's one criteria.
True.
find a match is null. That means there should be an existing contact present, and if it finds, and it's storing in this variable, so this will just identify that there is a matching contact, and
What do you
that
mean?
should
Did you define that, or did you just get to do a lookup for find a match? Like how
find
did you define those resources?
find is matches this. So this is a resource that I defined over here. In the get records,
Does everything on the left-hand side automatically get created when you're going through these components on the flow screen? Or are you adding the elements from the left-hand side?
Yeah, the values in blue are variables or resources that she has created.
Got it. Okay. So when you go back to that decision, did you manually define that resource, those two resource fields?
yes, I did. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that, yeah, the first one is that the API name of the toggle on her screen. And the second is the API name of that get records lookup, which is the previous element that was looking at.
And the previous element has that essentially API name defined somewhere?
Yeah, that's
okay.
That's what she named it.
Okay. When once this is the screen element is configured, you'll get the API names of what it is, and then it's easier for you to relatively match them accordingly. So once we get to the decision, if we don't find an existing, basically I'm creating with a create record element, I am just creating a record of contact using the contact variable. So you can just create a record with first name, last name, and the account. If I want, I can of course just
got it. Does this exclude any validation rules that you may have on a contact? Like, could it potentially fail if it?
Yes, it could. So the big difference, what to keep in mind between screen flows and auto launch flows is screen flows operate under the user context, meaning it respects all of the permissions and validation rules and that sort of thing of the user running it. So it could possibly, depending on your validation rules. Auto launched flows will run under system context, so it has basically full access. So it's there's a potential for it to fail.
Got it. If it goes through that screen flow part with the user. Okay. Okay.
And then the last step is just assignment, where I am just setting the contact ID with the matching contact ID with the contact ID of my variable defined. And then I'm just updating the records over here. So that's all I'm doing in the end. So probably, I think we still have time. Andrea, you can just run through the session attendees flow that you have.
Sure. Let me, where did my Zoom go?
And then just for people that are going to be viewing this, yeah, if you want to give just full context of the use case.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay. Do you guys see my flow screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, good. My Zoom control ran away. So essentially what we were doing with our use case flow, so we wanted to create a flow that in the background, when an attendee record was updated to the registration status was registered, we wanted to look up any sessions associated with that event that were marked mandatory, and we want to automatically register those attendees into those mandatory sessions by creating the session attendee records. So this is something that we wouldn't be able to do with Process Builder because we don't have the ability to selectively filter the child records, in this case of the event, which would be the sessions, to figure out which ones are mandatory so that we can then create this session attendee records. So that's why we end up using Flow for this. And flows can be launched in a number of ways. So you saw Aishwarya's screen flow, which she had embedded on. We were looking at it in debug mode, but she had it also embedded on the Lightning record page, where a user could use it just from their record page. This particular auto launch process is launched from Process Builder every time a an attendee record is created or updated or edited and has a registration status of registered. You can also launch flows from an Apex trigger, from a button on the page layout, or embedded in a Lightning community or Lightning component. So what we're doing here first, we're passing the attendee record ID in through Process Builder. So you define your flow as an action, run flow as an action, available action in Process Builder. And we're passing in the attendee ID, which triggered this Process Builder, into our flow. So this is kind of this is how we kind of start everything out to make sure we're working with the right records. So our first 3 steps are to gather all the records that we need to use this process that are going to be relevant. So in our first element, we're getting our attendee records. This is just filtered by attendee ID, which is what we passed in through Process Builder. So we're essentially just grabbing the one record with this element. You can either grab one record, or you can grab all the records, or a subset if you define filters here.
Quick question too. So when you say like the first record or all records,
Mm-hmm.
obviously there can be a group of people that register around the same time. Does that has nothing to do with this, correct?
So if you didn't define a specific record ID and you just came in and grabbed all records, it will grab everything. You can grab all. If you maybe defined an event ID here instead of the attendee ID, you could grab all attendees that are associated with a specific event ID.
Oh, so it would essentially include all attendees, even though what had started this was just one attendee. It would essentially go through the entire object of records created for that. Oh, this is okay. Yeah, we definitely want to keep it to
for sure
only the first record
for this case. And so what we're having, so we're gonna just grab the first record, and we're gonna have Salesforce automatically store all the fields for this record into a record variable, which is just a container that's kind of temporarily holding all the data and all the fields from our single record. So the next step, we are going to get any all sessions filtered, first of all, by whether or not they are mandatory. And also the second criteria, we also want to only get session records that are associated with the same event that the attendee is associated with. Otherwise, we would get all mandatory sessions in the database, regardless of what event they are associated with. So in this case, because we can have more than one mandatory session, instead of just storing the first record, we're storing all of the records that match our criteria into a record collection variable that we're going to loop through in a second. And in this case, we've created a record collection variable. We just called it mandatory sessions, and we only need the session ID for this flow. So that's all.
So that record collection, you're not referencing that from anything. You've literally just created that term. If you scroll down, by yourself, like this is.
We just had to create a container to hold our record for our.
And did you have to create that somewhere outside of this before being able to reference it in the record collection?
You can. So right now we're not seeing the option, but if we didn't have, usually there's a new resource option at the top, would be above any available resources, where you could, and that's pretty complicated. I know we definitely don't have time to run through that right now, but you can, there's a lot of different resources you can create, but you can do them from within the element and inside of Flow. Okay, and then the next step is another record lookup, and in this case, we want to grab any existing session attendee records to, because we're going to have to look at this list as well to make sure that if maybe the attendee is already registered for this session, that we don't duplicate that and create a session. So in this lookup, we are just grabbing any attendees that have session attendee records for that event. And we're storing, because there could be multiple, we're storing them again in a record variable here. Okay, and next step, we're right at time. Do you guys need to jump? Do we need to reschedule? Maybe do this?
No, if you guys can keep going, I'm going to let the recording continue. I do have to go to a management meeting, but yeah, let it keep recording.
Got it. Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So the next step after we've gathered all the records that we're going to need at this point to go through the rest of our flow, we're going to go to a decision element. So the reason for this right now is really as a I guess like a null check, like with coding essentially, because we want to make sure that if we had no session records, let's say if there were for whatever reason the event didn't have any session records, or there were no session records marked mandatory, and this record came up with no no results essentially. We need to tell the flow what to do next, because the next step in this, the next actionable step is the loop, which will it's going to go through our session records. But first, we want to make sure that there are session records to go through. So our decision element is going to look at our mandatory session record collection variable and make sure it's not empty. It's going to, we're going to make sure we have something we need to loop through. If there are mandatory sessions for that event, then it's going to, the decision will continue into the loop. But if that record variable is empty and there are no mandatory sessions or no sessions at all associated with the event, then it's going to essentially end the flow. It just goes to a blank assignment element that does nothing. And it's just, it's almost like a fault path. It ensures that the flow doesn't fail because there are no records found. And so just like with our flow example, there are mandatory sessions for our example. And we're gonna go into our loop. So this is one of the big features that flow offers that you can't do with Process Builder. So since we collected all those mandatory sessions into that mandatory sessions record collection variable, we have to actually isolate each record within that variable and send it through a series of actions to be able to work with it individually. And in this case would be, we need to grab the session IDs individually so we can work with them separately. So once we enter this flow, our next step is a decision. So this is looking at the first session ID. In this case, in this example, there are 4 mandatory sessions. And so this is taking the first session and going through some other steps before circling back around and doing the same thing with the other session IDs that we've collected. And so that's why it's called a loop, because it loops through all of your records that you've collected and runs the logic for each of them. So let's see. The first step inside of our loop is to check and see, first of all, if there are any existing session attendees. And so we collected our session attendees in this element up here. And so the point of this step is really to check and see if there is already a session attendee record that matches both our attendee and the session ID from the loop that we're in, so that we don't duplicate and create a new session attendee record where there already is one. Mm-hmm. So we're first going to go through and check that, and it loops through. We have a second loop inside of our kind of the main loop here that will take that session ID, check it against our session attendee and our attendee, and see if they match. If there's already a match, then it doesn't, there are no further steps to create a new session attendee record. It just takes us right back to our primary loop, which is going through the IDs. If there is not a match, then it is going to continue in our primary loop, which will create, not at this point, I can't say create, because at this point it's not creating the session attendee records. It is just adding kind of a placeholder. So it's adding all of the necessary data into the fields we'll need to create the session attendee records at the end. So if there's not a session attendee record that matches, it is going to come to this assignment element, which just lets you pass data from one variable to another inside your flow. And in this case, it is passing through the session ID, the attendee ID, and it's updating the registration status to registered. So when our records are created, these are the data that will go into those fields. At this point, it won't have a record ID for the new record. That will happen at the very end. The point of doing this is because when we go back into our flow to check the next session, all of the fields are going to be in that loop variable will be overwritten. So we need to pass these IDs into a new session attendee record variable so that it can continue to go through the loop and gather the data we need from the other sessions. Okay, and then once it has gone through and created that record variable, then we go to another assignment element, which is going to take our new session attendee that we created in the last assignment. It's going to add it to a collection variable because we're going to have, there's a potential to have more than one session attendee ID if we have multiple mandatory sessions. So we're taking the record that we're going to create or we assign in the last element, and we're adding it to a collection. And from that collection, we'll mass create our records at the end.
Quick question, Andrea. Can we just have those create records inside the loop to, you know, save this, because we are again having we need a collection variable to again pass for creating each record.
So you can. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have?
No, that's all.
Okay, so you can do that, but it's not best practice. It is not because creating records, updating records, looking up, deleting records, those are that's DML, and it is not best practice to put those in loops, just like with coding, just because the chance of hitting governor limits is high. So, you know, we could. The scope of this, especially for our specific example, is pretty small. So, you know, we only have four mandatory sessions that we would want to create session attendee records for. So if we were to put a create records element inside of our loop for this small example, we'd be fine. You know, there's nothing really to worry about because the scope is limited. But to make it scalable and to ensure that it won't fail if we have a greater number of records, if we're creating a lot of records, we want to limit the number of DML statements in our flow, and we don't want to do it inside a loop. So while it will work, you know, it totally would work. It's just not best practice to do it that way. But it's the same reason that we also had to nest this loop within this loop. We essentially had to nest loops because we're having to compare the values in our session record collection variable to values inside of any existing session attendee records. So we're comparing two lists essentially. You know, and it would make this flow less complex to build and understand if we were to have, if we could add like a get records element inside the loop or add a create records element inside the loop. It's just doesn't align with best practices, but it will work in most cases. In smaller examples, it works. That's why we've done it this way. So instead of that, what we have to do, we're essentially looping through our sessions, making sure that we don't have existing session attendee records already that match both the session ID and attendee ID. And if they don't match, then we are going to add the new values to our record variable, which we then have to add to a record collection variable, because then our loop starts over and puts new values into that loop. So that's essentially what we have to do. So then once that loop finishes, we have, after the last session record is sent through the loop, then we create our records. And so what's cool about this is because we've already defined all of our values in by assigning them to the individual record variables and then putting them into a record collection variable. We don't have to really define anything when creating the records. It's just creating whatever we've added to our new session attendee collection. So we are creating multiple records in this case. And it's just taking the data in the fields that we've assigned, and it's creating the records in Salesforce for us. So just to see that in action, just like we were looking at with Ashwarya's screen flow example, I'm just going to go to the debug panel. This is my favorite thing about Flow, I think, is because like you really, I mean, you can test at any point.
Yeah, you don't have to write a long email to check the error. So this is
right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, and working with this helped me really understand those error emails that you get from Flow a lot, because essentially what's in the debug details is that's in those long emails that you get. But then you can kind of look through your debug details and look back to sort of the visual layout of your flow, and it helps you understand it a little more, but what's going on, it helps with troubleshooting. In this case, I've already got an existing attendee ID that I deleted all of the session attendee records, but so let's say I wanted to just test our flow on an existing attendee record. I'm just going to copy the ID from the URL, and I'm going to go back to my debug screen. And this is where you can input your variable. So this is essentially, this is what Process Builder is doing for us when a new session attendee record is created or it's updated with the registration status of registered. I don't have to feed a session ID in. Attendee ID is the only thing that Process Builder is filling in, pushing into this flow. So I'm going to just paste my attendee ID and run this flow. And so it gives you the full rundown, or the full, yeah, all the details at runtime for the tests we just went through. But I should be able to come back to this. Get rid of my Zoom bar here. Come back to this list of session attendees, and then you can see that that test pushed, created those session attendee records. And just as Ashwarya was showing you guys with her example, if we were to do nothing and just run this again, because we put that check in there that checks for existing session attendee records, it's not going to add any additional records. Whereas if we hadn't put in that second loop that checks for session attendee records, it would have created 4 more session attendee records, because there's no way of, the system has no way of knowing that they exist already. We had to build that in as well. A couple of things, just in general, some tips I would have working with Flow. I think what I do, because it is still very visual. I mean, this is a flow chart essentially, and it's always helped me to sort of map out a design before I start building. So just sort of conceptually write down the design of your flow, because it works left to right, downstream, upstream. You need to keep in mind the overall, the steps you need to take, and make sure that you're feeding the correct data into each step of the flow to make sure things don't fail. So I always like to map out my flows first before really building them in the builder. Another important thing, and this is the same with coding, is details are very important. So kind of keep in mind that you might not be the only person that has to troubleshoot or edit your flows. So it's important to put as much context and detail into them as you can. I think all elements, most of them have these description fields where you can put some information. Use good naming conventions. Everybody sort of has their preferences on naming conventions for resources and elements, but be as descriptive as you can, so that anybody who's inheriting this flow, or if you have a coworker that has to also troubleshoot the flows, that you're providing enough information for somebody to come in after you and understand what's going on. the other thing, like, it's always good to define fault paths. I didn't really define fault paths, but, you know, in the event that there's a record lookup or, you know, there's an error in creating a record, you can create additional elements and create, if I were to have an additional element and pull a connector down to it, this would be, you would see it's like a red dotted line that says fault, and it really just tells the flow what to do if a certain step fails. So that's a best practice that we haven't built into this flow, but it's always good to keep that in mind so that, you know, you can prevent those big red ugly errors for users, and you can, you know, say a certain step fails. Well, instead of, you know, blocking the user from moving forward, if feasible, you could, if it's a screen flow, you can, you know, show them a certain error message that's more descriptive than the sort of red generic one you can get when a flow fails from Salesforce. Or you can say, okay, send an email or open a case internally. There's, you know, you can define what happens when a flow fails. Also to, you know, null check, just like with encoding. So just make sure that you're thinking about different places where things could go wrong, and then you can define what to do if they do go wrong, which is a cool thing that you can do with Flow. And again, just like Process Builder, just with Apex, don't hard code IDs. You're going to have a bad time if you hard code IDs just because they're org specific. And if you deploy a flow into another org with hard-coded IDs, like if you're going from sandbox to production, then your flow is not going to work because the IDs are going to be different. And then we've already talked about some of the others, like you know, don't put DML inside loop. So try and stick with if you're creating or updating records outside of you want to make sure you do that outside the flow, and instead you just store your new values, your replacement values, into record variables or record collection variables. And then once you exit your flow, you can, you know, create, update, delete records that you want. And I think that's it. Do you have anything else you want to add, Ashwarya?
You just laid it out very beautifully, and I guess it's really good to have you know, follow the best practices, and then as you say, create a flow chart of your own, and then probably get started from there. So basic, I think we can have some trailheads that you can, you know, go through to have create you know, to create basic flows, structures, and that will just help you get started with it. And yeah, and I guess we can go from there. Lindsay?
Yeah. Well, thank you both. This was really great. I think we took in a lot of information today, so it was really cool to see the two different types of flows. Ashley gave me the ownership of the meeting, so I'll make sure I convert this recording and we can share it out with the rest of the team. I think, Brett, you and I should probably try to go through and recreate some of these flows that Andrea and Ashwarya put together, because that will really help us just go through it a second time. And I think doing it ourselves is going to be really beneficial. And once we do that, I'm sure we'll have questions, so we'll come to you. But thank you for doing this. This was really great.
Awesome.
Andrea, thank you guys. And I also have we also have a document that, if you want, can share with the customers for this particular use case. So,
okay. Yes, that would be awesome. I know that we were working on a doc, but if you have something, Ashwarya, let's sync up on that so we can get this out.
perfect. Sounds good.
All right. Well, I don't have any other questions. Brett, do you?
No, I hopped in here a little late, but there's a lot of information in here.
It's a lot, yeah.
I think after building one myself, I think things will be a lot clearer.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Just takes time and practice. There's just a learning curve, but a more gradual learning curve than, like, you know, say Apex.